The dense jungle pressed against the narrow path, thick with vines that coiled like ancient snakes and towering trees that reached for the sky, blocking out all but slivers of light. The air was heavy with moisture, thick with the rich scent of earth and decay. In the distance, the rhythmic thud of elephant feet on soft earth echoed faintly through the trees. Liam, a young man with weathered skin and a deep-set gaze, walked the trail with purpose, the weight of his boots muffled by the dampness of the ground beneath him. His eyes scanned the horizon, a look of quiet tension etched across his face. He had worked at the sanctuary for over 6 years now, a place nestled deep in the forest where elephants roamed freely, untouched by the outside world. It was the perfect haven, he had always thought, but lately there had been something off. The sanctuary was founded years ago, a refuge for elephants rescued from poaching rings or captive lives. It was a place of peace, or it had been. But lately, it was as though the air had thickened with something unspoken, something unseen but felt. The elephants, particularly the matriarch Zuri, had begun behaving strangely. He pushed through the underbrush, the faint sounds of the elephants growing louder with each step. Zuri had always been a presence, not just for the elephants, but for him as well. She was old now, her skin a tapestry of wrinkles and scars, but still strong, still wise. She had been the first to arrive at the sanctuary, the one he had cared for, the one who had taught him everything about elephants and how to coexist with such magnificent creatures. But now, even she seemed restless. Liam reached the clearing, his eyes scanning the familiar terrain where the elephants usually grazed. The massive creatures loomed ahead, the sight of them almost surreal against the dense backdrop of the jungle. Zuri was at the center, her immense body swaying slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though she were listening to something far beyond the reach of human ears. Her eyes, usually calm and wise, were wide and unsettled, her trunk raised, twitching slightly, as if sensing danger. The other elephants stood scattered around her, restless, their ears flapping intermittently, eyes darting toward the distant trees. The younger ones were huddling close to the older elephants, instinctively seeking protection. Liam's gaze swept over them, a sudden unease creeping up his spine. He stepped closer to Zuri, his heart racing. There was a low, almost imperceptible rumble in the air, vibrating through his chest like the distant growl of thunder. But there was no storm in sight, only the heavy stillness that surrounded them. Zuri's tusks gleamed faintly in the dim light, and she shifted, her massive body pivoting toward the trees. Her movements were deliberate, cautious. Liam's breath caught in his throat as he followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. Through the dense forest, beyond the thick curtain of branches, there was something. A shape moving, shifting between the trunks. At first it was just a flicker, a shadow in the corner of his eye, but then it became more distinct. A figure, pale and humanoid, crossing between the trees with unnatural grace. Liam's instincts flared, his pulse quickening. The forest was full of wildlife, but nothing that walked on 2 legs with such eerie fluidity. The wind picked up suddenly, rustling through the leaves, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that sent a shiver down Liam's spine. Zuri trumpeted sharply, the sound of her call slicing through the silence. The herd began to stir, anxious, their low trumpeting calls rising in unison. Liam swallowed hard, his hand instinctively reaching for the machete at his side. He stepped forward cautiously, keeping his eyes trained on the moving figure. The tension was thick, suffocating, and yet the figure moved with a deliberate slowness that unnerved him. Then the figure paused. It stood perfectly still, staring directly at Liam. The trees around them were silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. For a moment, Liam felt the weight of the figure's gaze, cold and unsettling. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the thick underbrush. Liam froze, his breath caught in his chest. His heart hammered in his ears as he stared at the empty space where the figure had been. But there was no sign of movement. No rustling leaves. He turned to Zuri. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body tense. She stepped forward, her movements slow, as if urging him to follow. Liam didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, the elephants trailing him closely. Zuri led the way, her massive frame cutting through the jungle with an almost unnatural grace. The forest seemed to close in around them as they made their way deeper into the trees. The sounds of the elephants' steps were muffled now, as if the earth itself had grown softer underfoot. And then the smell hit him. It was faint at first, a sour stench, like rotting meat. But it grew stronger, more distinct as they pushed forward. Liam's throat tightened as he recognized the scent. Blood. His eyes darted to Zuri, who was now moving with a deliberate urgency, her ears flicking back and forth as she picked up speed. The herd was following, but they too were anxious, their eyes scanning the surroundings, constantly on edge. Zuri reached the source of the smell, and Liam's stomach churned. The clearing ahead was unlike anything he had ever seen. In the center of the clearing lay the remains of a massive elephant, its body torn apart as if something had attacked it with a ruthless, animalistic hunger. Blood stained the ground, pooling around the carcass in a grotesque display. The once proud creature was unrecognizable. Liam stumbled back, his heart sinking into his stomach. This was not the work of poachers. It was too brutal, too much. And then he saw it. On the opposite side of the clearing, a small, blood-stained figure moved. An elephant calf, no more than a year old. Its legs trembled as it attempted to stand, its body weak, but its eyes were wild, frantic, and bloodshot. Liam stepped forward cautiously, his instincts telling him to approach the calf with care, but Zuri stopped him. She let out a deep, resonating trumpet, and the herd closed in around him. The air seemed to grow colder as the elephants circled the carcass, and then it happened. The earth trembled beneath them, a low, deep vibration that started to build. The trees around them shook, and then, with a deafening roar, a massive shape erupted from the undergrowth. It was an elephant, but not one of the sanctuaries. This one was different. Its eyes were empty, its tusk jagged and broken, and its massive frame was covered in scars. It was wild, primal, driven by a hunger that Liam could feel in his bones. The herd backed away, their trumpets rising in a chorus of fear and warning. The wild elephant lunged, its tusks aimed at Zuri, who stood firm, the matriarch of the herd. The battle was swift and brutal, the air thick with the sounds of crashing tusks and trumpeting calls. Liam watched, helpless, as the wild elephant charged again, this time making a deadly connection with Zuri. The force of the impact sent her sprawling to the ground, her body writhing in agony. But then, the unthinkable happened. The young calf, trembling but fierce, charged toward the wild elephant. In a moment of instinct and sheer will, it collided with the wild elephant's flank, knocking it off balance. For a brief fleeting moment, the wild elephant faltered. It was enough. Zuri, with all her remaining strength, struck. The wild elephant stumbled, its massive body crashing to the ground. The clearing fell silent, save for the sounds of heavy breathing and the distant rustling of leaves. The herd stood around Zuri, watching, waiting. The calf approached slowly, its eyes wide with something like understanding. Liam moved forward, his steps heavy, his heart still racing. He kneeled beside Zuri, who was breathing shallowly. The wild elephant was gone, its body now a part of the jungle once more. Zuri's gaze met his, and for a moment, there was no fear in her eyes, just a quiet, knowing strength. Then, slowly, she lowered her head and closed her eyes. Liam stayed beside her, watching the herd slowly gather around. The forest had witnessed a battle for survival, one that would linger in the air for years to come. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, the jungle seemed to exhale. The tension, once thick enough to cut through, began to lift, leaving only the quiet murmurs of the elephants and the distant rustling of leaves. But Liam knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The jungle, once a place of calm, now felt alive with a different energy. The weight of the battle hung heavy in the air, and the faint scent of blood lingered in the atmosphere like a haunting reminder of what had just transpired. Liam stood up, slowly, his gaze never leaving the herd. Zuri lay still, her breath shallow but steady. He knew she wouldn't be able to rise on her own, and the herd, though still shaken, was watching her with an intense reverence. The calf, once trembling in fear, now stood beside her, its small trunk reaching out to nudge her gently as though offering comfort. The young elephant had fought for its own survival, and in doing so, it had taken its first step into the world of the wild. It was a world full of danger, but also of strength. A world that now belonged to it, and Zuri had seen it. Liam's hands trembled as he reached for his radio, but as he did, the low growl of distant thunder rumbled in the air, sending a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the sound of a coming storm. This was something deeper, a vibration that seemed to resonate from the ground itself. He lowered the radio slowly, looking around, his heart skipping in his chest. The jungle was never still, but there was something unsettling about the way it had fallen into an eerie silence. Zuri's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Liam thought he saw recognition in them. He knelt beside her again, his voice soft, but he knew she wouldn't respond. She had led the herd for so long, and now she lay broken, the weight of years and leadership finally too much to bear. But she was not alone. The herd stood by her, and the young calf stood watch, its eyes bright with uncertainty but filled with the unspoken knowledge of its new role. Liam's gaze turned once more to the dense undergrowth, his breath steadying as the air seemed to thicken once again. There was movement in the shadows, a subtle rustle that made his pulse race. The ground trembled again, this time stronger, as though something enormous was approaching. But it wasn't an elephant. The jungle around him seemed to close in. The trees creaked in the wind, their twisted branches like ancient hands reaching out, clawing at the sky. It was then that he heard it. Soft at first, like the whisper of a distant cry. It wasn't an elephant. It was a human voice, muffled, strained. It carried with it an undertone of desperation. Liam's mind raced, but before he could fully comprehend the situation, a figure emerged from the shadows. An older man, hunched and covered in mud, his clothes tattered, his face obscured by a matted beard. His eyes were wide, frantic. He stumbled forward, his gaze locked on the elephants, but when his eyes fell on the fallen Zuri, he froze. The wildness of his expression shifted to something deeper. Recognition, maybe regret, maybe guilt. Liam took a step toward him, but the man didn't seem to notice him at first. Instead, his eyes were fixed on Zuri, on the calf standing near her side. The ground beneath them shuddered again, and the herd grew agitated, stepping back in unison, as if warning Liam. The man looked at them, his breath catching. Slowly, his gaze drifted to Liam, meeting his eyes for the first time. "You're the keeper," the man rasped, his voice hoarse, full of a kind of terrible understanding. Liam didn't respond. His heart was pounding, his mind working quickly to make sense of what was happening. But the man's words seemed to echo in the silence around them. She knew what would happen, the man muttered to himself, his eyes glazed with exhaustion and fear. Zuri, she knew the blood would come. She knew the wild ones would return. Liam's stomach tightened. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man turned toward him, his gaze wild. "I was part of the sanctuary. He stopped, as if the words were too much to bear. The shame in his eyes was palpable. He seemed to stumble over his words as he reached into the folds of his jacket and pulled out a tattered map, covered in dirt and smudged with blood. It was never meant to stay like this. We thought we could keep the elephants safe. We thought we could protect them, but the sanctuary was built on blood, on greed, on betrayal." His voice faltered as he glanced once more at the fallen elephant. Liam's pulse quickened. The weight of the man's words hit him like a thunderclap. The sanctuary wasn't what he thought it was. The blood wasn't just from poaching. It ran deeper. Betrayal. Greed. The wild ones. Before Liam could speak, the ground beneath them rumbled again, this time with an unmistakable ferocity. The jungle itself seemed to groan as the trees began to shake. There was no mistaking it now. The wild elephants were not alone. Something else was coming. The herd tensed, their bodies aligning as one, ready for whatever force was moving toward them. But this wasn't just a force of nature. This was something deeper. The old man's eyes widened with realization, and his breath came faster, like he had just remembered something terrifying. "They're back," he whispered, and then he dropped to his knees, his body convulsing as if some terrible force had taken hold of him. He reached for the earth, his hands clawing at the soil as if he was trying to bury himself in it. His voice became a frenzied chant, repeating the same words over and over. "The wild ones are coming. They're coming for us all." Liam backed away slowly, his heart thumping in his chest as the jungle seemed to come alive with a new, terrible energy. The elephants huddled closer, their massive forms shielding the calf and Zuri, their trumpets rising in a fierce, defiant chorus. And then, from the farthest reaches of the jungle, the roar came. It was a sound like nothing he had ever heard. It wasn't just the thunder of footsteps. It was the cry of a world that had been forgotten, a cry of nature reclaiming its territory. Liam turned and ran, pushing through the dense undergrowth, his chest tightening with each step. Behind him, the sound of crashing trees and heavy thuds reverberated through the air. His mind raced. He had to get to the others. He had to get to the sanctuary's heart before it was too late. But as he ran, a chilling thought began to form in his mind. The wild ones were coming for more than just the sanctuary. They were coming for something deeper, something that the earth itself had been holding back for far too long. And in the shadows of the jungle, a darker force waited, an ancient hunger, one that had been awakened by betrayal and blood. The jungle had come alive, and its hunger was unstoppable. Liam pushed forward through the thick undergrowth, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Each step felt heavier, as if the jungle itself were conspiring to slow him down, to trap him in the heart of its dense, suffocating embrace. The roar of the wild ones, distant but growing closer, was a constant reminder that time was running out. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the air around him seemed to hum with the energy of something vast and ancient, something that had been disturbed, that was coming back for what had been taken from it. He reached the clearing where the sanctuary's main building stood, its weathered stone walls half hidden by the encroaching jungle. The gates, usually secured, now stood open, as if waiting for him, beckoning him to step inside. But Liam hesitated. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The man's words echoed in his mind. The sanctuary was built on blood, on greed, on betrayal. The unease that had been growing inside him now felt like a cold weight in his chest. He glanced back, half expecting to see the herd of elephants following him, their massive forms looming like silent sentinels. But the clearing was empty. Zuri, the calf, and the rest of the herd had disappeared into the jungle, their trumpeting cries now distant whispers. The jungle had reclaimed its own. Liam stepped forward, entering the sanctuary with caution. His eyes scanned the familiar surroundings, but they felt different now. Darker, more ominous. The once vibrant flora seemed withered, the trees twisted in unnatural shapes as though the life had been sucked out of them. A strange quiet had fallen over the place, a stillness that wasn't natural. It was as if the earth itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen,